Hi, I'm Ross. I'm the Executive Director here at Hope and Home, and we're talking about ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. If you have tuned into this, it's probably because you're a foster parent and you have just found out that ICWA applies to the case that you are in. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean when the judge declares that ICWA, quote, applies? We're going to talk about that, but first I want to back up a little bit and tell you a little bit more about who I am and why I'm involved in ICWA. In addition to being the Executive Director here at Hope and Home, I'm also an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation. I have spent the last 30 years working with the Cherokee Nation, other nations, in particular the Paiutes, and really love working with the Indian community as they interface with the government and with treatment facilities. Okay, so I have spent the last 30 years of my life as a volunteer helping Indian nations work with Departments of Human Services, and more importantly, helping the Department of Human Services interface with the Indian community. Not an easy thing to do. And for a lot of people, it's very upsetting when they find out that ICWA applies to their case. So we're going to take that apart. We're going to deconstruct it and talk about what exactly does that mean that ICWA applies. In order to do this, we have to first back up and ask, what is ICWA? ICWA is an act between two governments, the Indian community, which is a government, a sovereign nation, and the United States. This was an act that was enacted in 1978 for a very, very good reason. And the reason is, at that point in time, estimates were between 35 and 40% of all Indian children were adopted out of their Indian community, and 90% of the cases by non-Indians. Let me go back and say that again. 35 to 45% of all Indian children were not living with their parents. They were adopted out, and 90% of those cases, they were adopted out to non-Indian families. So what was going on at that point in time was the whole-scale decimation of the Indian world. Imagine if that was allowed to continue. By this time, there would be no Indian nation. All the children would be adopted out, and we wouldn't have Indian communities. So the government recognized this and enacted ICWA, which did something different in the child welfare world that has never been done before, and that is to establish group rights for the Indian community, that the Indian community, the Indian nation, has a right to their own children. Throughout the United States, we normally have laws that talk about rugged individualism. We talk about individual responsibility, individual rights. In this case, in addition to being concerned about the best interest of a child, we're also interested in the best interest of the tribe. Now, there have been a lot of laws that have followed this. Most recently, a clarification law that went into effect just last year that made it very clear. The best interest of the child is to be in an Indian home. Okay, so let me back that up and say that under ICWA, the best interest of the child is to be in an Indian home. So if you are a foster parent and suddenly you find out that ICWA applies to your case, what that might feel like to you is, oh my gosh, they're going to come in and take my child away from me. First of all, let's recognize if you're in a foster care case, not your child, right? We know that. It's still in the custody of the Department of Human Services. So we're not taking anyone's child away from them. What we're doing is we're recognizing that that child is Indian and that child has a tribe, and that tribe has some rights to that child, okay? Now, they're still going to look for what's in the best interest of that child, but they're going to look first through a hierarchy. They want that child to stay with their parents, if possible, with the Indian community that they're in, if possible, and if not, with an Indian community in general. So that is the hierarchy that is part of ICWA. ICWA actually has 4 different components. First is identification. We have to identify who is an Indian child. More complicated than you would think. There are over 40 definitions of what is Indian, who is an Indian, in the federal government. As far as ICWA is concerned, it's a tribal member or someone who has the ability to be a tribal member. Once a child has been identified, then what has to happen is notification. the tribe has to be notified and given the right to get involved in the case if they want. Now, this is very important. They have the right to get involved at any point. Okay, so you can't like rush the case through and get it adopted before the tribe gets involved. In that case, that's considered fraud, and the tribe has 2 more years to actually undo an adoption. And that's very important. You do not want to rush an adoption through so that you can get it done before the Indian world is aware of it. You cannot do that. If you do that, that's considered fraud, and they have the right to undo that adoption. So identification is first, notification is second. It is critical that Departments of Human Services notify the Indian tribe that the child is from, or the Indian tribes that the child is from, so that we don't get to the end of the case, adoption occurs, then they find out and they undo the adoption. So it's important that we notify the tribe. So again, the first step is identification. The second step is notification. The third step is what's called active efforts that need to be made for reunification or for that child to stay within their community. We're not going to go into the differences here, but it's important to understand. You can easily look up what the latest interpretation of active efforts is. Now, in addition to identification, notification, active efforts, we also have what are called the hierarchy. The hierarchy is where children ideally should be. They should ideally be with their family first, their tribe second, with anybody in the Indian community, and if we can't stay within the Indian community, then at least in an Indian-run facility. Now, we don't like facilities if we can all avoid them, but if they're Indian run, that's still better than non-Indian run. So that is the hierarchy of placements. Now, what does that mean to you as a parent? Very simple. It does not mean that the child is immediately going to be taken and remanded into tribal court. In general, most tribes are very reasonable and they want the best for the child. And odds are the biological parents are where you are. That's normal. If a child is removed in the community, it's probably because the parents are in that community. Most Indian courts want to have a say. They want to be involved. They want to make sure ICWA is responded to and ICWA is appropriately followed. But they don't necessarily want to grab the child and remand them to tribal court. There's a lot of expenses in that, and that usually moves the child away from the biological parent that we're trying to reunify with. So the odds are things are not going to happen very quickly, and the odds are the child's not going to be moved immediately away from the court in the jurisdiction that you're in. What it does mean is that the tribe will be notified. The tribe has the option to step in and take over. Odds are they won't. Odds are they'll follow the case and just make sure that their needs are being met in terms of taking care of the child and making sure the child's cultural heritage is taken care of, is followed, is respected. So that's the first thing that's going to happen. The second thing that's going to happen is they're going to look for a placement that is a native placement. Now, that may or may not mean that they're going to move the child from you. Odds are, if you're not Indian, they're going to be faced with a dilemma. How long has the child been in your home? Are there other Indian homes available? If there are no other Indian homes available, you're knocked down lower on the hierarchy, but you're still a placement option. Notice that we said with the Indian family, with the Indian community, with any Indian. Then also we go to an Indian-run program. But if none of those work, we're still going to look for the best available option, and that may be the home that you're in. So that's going to apply. The ICWA hierarchy will apply, and then active efforts. The caseworker is going to have to do more than what's called reasonable efforts to get the child home. And again, these are all good things. They might be unsettling because they sometimes come as a big rush. All of a sudden, it's something that you didn't expect. But they're all things that really do make sense for the child. And I can tell you, having run a child welfare agency, I have seen Indian tribes get involved and have a very beneficial effect on the case. It's not all scary. It's not all something to dread. In most cases, when the Indian tribe gets involved, it's very helpful. Okay, so what should you do if you discover that your case is now an ICWA case? First of all, don't freak out. Second of all, talk with the county attorney, ask what impact this has on your case. It may have none. Third of all, understand that ICWA is going to require that the hierarchy be looked at. It does not automatically mean that the child will be removed from you. you have a much better case of having your child not be removed if you do not fight ICWA. This is very, very important. The number one thing for you to do is to work with it. It is there, it exists, it's not going away, and the best thing that you can do is find out what the rules and regulations are going to be like under an ICWA case. What are the efforts that are going to be made? What are they? How do they differ from reasonable efforts? How do active efforts differ from reasonable efforts? These are great questions to ask. And most importantly, show that you're willing to work with, not against, the Indian tribe. This is the most important thing I can tell you. Work with, not against the Indian tribe. Don't freak out. Don't make the Indian tribe the enemy. Don't post on social media how upset you are that your child is now involved in ICWA, how it's unfair. Don't do these things. Instead, embrace the fact that the child's heritage is being looked after. This is a good thing for the child. And welcome the Indian nation into your home, literally and figuratively. I've had Departments of Human Services have children in a non-Indian home, and that home has invited the Navajo Nation to actually come into their home and inspect their home, learn about their home. Actually, people have stayed in their home. The caseworker, when they came up, stayed in this person's home. They made themselves very open and available to the Indian nation. This is really important. Do not demonize them. Do not say that ICWA is a bad law. Once you've gone down that path, it's very hard to recover. So number one thing to do is to align with ICWA, align with the tribe, and try and work together for the best interests of this kid and the nation. What not to do? Number one thing not to do is go get yourself a DNA test and try and figure out if you're Indian. Okay, this is the worst thing that you can do. This is not a loophole. This is not something that you can say, wow, if I can prove that I'm Indian, then this doesn't apply to me. Wrong. Okay, don't do that. Don't suddenly throw on a bunch of Indian jewelry. Don't suddenly try and figure out if you have an Indian princess in your background. These are all things that actually mock ICWA and mock the Indian nation. Don't do it. If you are not Indian, don't pretend to be Indian. Cultural misappropriation is deemed by the Indian nation the same way it is by any other culture as something that is very, very insulting. So do not do this. Another thing not to do is try and get a lawyer that will attack this whole process. Do not line up against the Indian nation. I kind of mentioned that before. So embrace this process, work with them, do not work against them, and try to have an open mind to being involved with the Indian nation. One thing that you can definitely do is try and learn as much as possible about the tribe that your child is from, and try and prove that you will be willing, if you were to adopt this child, to help them stay connected with their heritage. Again, these are just some quick tips on how to work with ICWA, not against it. If you suddenly find that you have an ICWA case, it's okay. Don't freak out. This is actually a good thing, not a bad thing, and it's something that you can actually benefit from if you approach it in the right way. Thank you for tuning in.